Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's Jessa. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. I appreciate you. I'm glad you're here. Glad you're tuning in. I am talking today to Jane Fleishman, who, what a delight. She late in life went and got a PhD. She's become a sexuality educator, and she has written such a great book called The Stonewall Generation. And it is about LGBTQ elders and their stories. Basically, it's 10 stories of people who were either at Stonewall or impacted by Stonewall, who, where it was a turning point in their lives. And she has done this amazing job of capturing an incredible diversity of people, partly with the goal to help increase the visibility of the diversity in the community, right? So it's not just young people. It's not just young white, cis males or something. So anyway, she's done this incredible job of finding their stories, centering their stories, sharing their stories so that we can understand what happened, how we can shift that spin, and the work, still needing to be done. That's part of what we're talking about too. So I hope you enjoy the show. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. So Jane, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Thank you for having me, Jess. I'm so excited.
Yeah, quite an accomplishment putting a book out. So I'm excited to get into that a little bit. But can we start with, this is sort of a little bit later in life endeavor for you, the sexuality education, right? So you want to give us a little picture of your journey, how you've ended up here?
Sure. So first of all, I am so happy to be on your show because, I have my own show with Rosara Teresi and now Jaylene Galarza, and we interview other people, but it's really fun to be interviewed. So thanks for having me. So I became a sexuality educator after I retired from a really wonderful and successful 30-year career in the public sector, in mental health and in education. My last job, like real job, like where you go to work. Remember those days before COVID?
Sort of vaguely.
My last regular job was at a large public psychiatric facility in Connecticut.
Wow.
Where I was the director of medical education and staff development. And it was a great job. I loved my job. I had a lot of fun. It was a chance to be innovative. I had a nice staff. I had like 500 people who were employed by the hospital. And there were no, that's not right. It's been a long time. We had 500 patients in the hospital. Think about that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the old state hospital formula, and 1,500 people on staff that we trained. So it was a big job. It was a lot of complications, but I retired happily and I never looked back.
I imagine getting there someday, but yes.
Yeah, you can just keep hope alive.
Right.
And as soon as I retired, I realized I want to keep working. I want to do another thing. I want to make trouble. I want to be a badass. Betty Dodson, God love her, is on her last days right now. And maybe by the time this is broadcast, I don't know, she may be gone. But she called herself, her initials are B-A-D, Betty Ann Dodson. And she was a badass. And I kind of want to follow in those footsteps. And so I decided to go back to school at age 56, and I finished my PhD at age 62.
Wow.
So that was cool, right? I mean,
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Really, thank you. That was really hard. It was like having a baby. Now, writing a book was also really hard, but doing my dissertation was great. And what happened was I'd always wondered, what it would be like for me. Was I capable inherently in my brain size and in on my organizational size to get a PhD? I never knew if I could do it. And it was a good challenge to put in front of myself. And, I was always the oldest person in all my classes and older than the professors. And I loved being back in school. I loved it. And I did a lot of work on, it was a PhD and an MED in human sexuality at Widener University, the Center for Human Sexuality Studies in Philadelphia. And I really did a lot of work on myself during that period and really came into my own. We always talk about people coming into their own sexually. I came into my own intellectually in many ways. So,
what made you choose that field? Why did you pick human sexuality?
I always loved talking about sex. It was easy. I mean, it was, and I thought this will be fun, right? I mean, it couldn't be more fun, as you know, to do this work and more meaningful, because the root of so many of our issues around the world are fundamentally challenging the interior design of who we are, sexually or in terms of our gender or orientation. And so it just seemed to me a really great fit for me, wanting to make a little more trouble, and also for me wanting to learn about something that's so fundamental to life.
So what does your troublemaking look like these days? Like, what are you doing with this PhD? I don't know if you finished it yesterday or if it's been a few years. But
So I finished my PhD in May of 2016.
Okay.
So that's long enough to publish a book.
Right.
And that's what I've been doing. I've been reading, I've been writing, I've been presenting. I have a specialty in sexuality and aging. So the people who come to hear my talks are either older adults themselves, who I love. I'm so excited whenever they come in and they tell me about how much fun they're having sex. And I feel so thrilled that they want to talk to me about it. But also, more importantly, the people who are either working with older adults in some gerontology kind of care, like social workers, psych, PT, OT, etc., or people who are training those people in gerontology.
Yeah.
And so that's who comes to my workshops, and that's what I do a lot. I, unfortunately, since, we talk about pre-COVID and post, before COVID, I used to go to senior living communities.
Right.
And I'd bring my condoms and the lube and my vulva puppet and my penis puppet, and we all laughed a lot, and I walked around. I can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So now I do everything online, and I have to say I'm getting better at it, and I like it, but I miss so much going in and really playing bingo with people, Generally, when I go to these places, I stay over the night before so I can get a feel for what it's like.
Oh, okay.
And if I'm lucky, I play bingo. And if I'm really lucky, I win 50 or 60 cents. And so it's really, it's kicking me right now that I don't get to do that.
Right. All right. So that leads into the topic of the book. When was it released?
Just this June of 2020.
June of 2020. Okay. Right. So you want to talk a little bit about where that came from, what you were hoping to accomplish with it?
The book is entitled The Stonewall Generation, LGBTQ Elders on Sex, Activism, and Aging. Those are three areas that I'm particularly concerned about as a sexuality educator. And I also have been a social justice activist for many, many years, for decades. And so I was looking at this frame of using the idea that the folks who are in my book are all LGBTQ elders who have lived extraordinary lives. You may not know some of these people.
Right, I don't.
They have been at the forefront of many different movements. So they're all activists in some way. And I asked them questions not only about what it's been like for them in terms of their coming out process, because as elders, many of them came out in the 50s, the 60s, before it was okay or legal or considered not a big deal. But I also asked them, because I'm a sexuality educator, about sex. And because I'm an activist, I asked them all sorts of stuff about politics. So the interviews were fantastic. And the reason I wrote this book is because, as I said before, I just finished my doctoral dissertation and my research just before I started writing the book. And it was a great study. I'm really proud of my study. And I actually would be happy to send you a link to the journal article I wrote about it with my two co-authors, Betsy Crane and Pat Koch, who are two amazing women in our field. They were also on my dissertation committee, so
Yeah.
I love them. They really did amazing work and were never compensated enough for the amount of tears that I shed. But after I finished that, I loved doing the research, but it was quantitative analysis. So I did the statistics behind sexual satisfaction in older adults in same-sex relationships. And I looked at the variables that would either mediate against or for sexual satisfaction for this population. Very few studies on this. Very few people care anything about older adult sexuality, particularly when you titrate it down into
right. When you narrow it down to same sex. Yeah.
Right, forget it. So it was great and it was really cool and I got great results, but I was really pining for the stories behind the numbers. So I started this process of searching out people who would be interested in being interviewed for a book. I didn't quite know what it would be like yet, but I knew it would be the stories behind the numbers.
Okay, so you have the idea for the book and then you sought out the people as opposed to, wow, I'm hearing some of these stories. I really got to capture this. Okay, right. You had this idea.
Yeah. And for years I'd heard stories from my elders and I loved them, but I didn't really know how to put it together. And so I worked with a number of really wonderful organizations around the country who helped me get the word out. SAGE is one of those organizations. And I don't know if they're that active in your state, but around the country, they have people in a lot of the LGBT community centers who focus on older adults in that community. And SAGE has been a real driving force for many, many decades now. And maybe we could put a link to them as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're really amazing people. So they helped me find people. And then I stood out on the street and I sent friends who were going to the last Michigan Women's Music Festival. I worked with OLOC, the Old Lesbians Organizing for Change. I worked with all the gay choruses. I went high and low and found some amazing people, and 10 of them are in my book. And what I realized was that the people who were changed by Stonewall, the event, the rebellion that occurred, that began on June 28th, 1969, and occurred for about 6 days in the Village in New York City, in Greenwich Village. There are people in my book who were there that night. And I thought my book would be about all these people who were there. And what I realized was that wasn't the most determining thing. The most determining factor was, how did Stonewall affect you in your ability to be a full human being as a gay man or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender person? And what I found was that most of the people in my book hadn't actually been there that night, but it had a profound influence on them. In fact, one thing I want to tell you that's very funny. Do you know Kate Bornstein? She's an amazing transgender woman who has really changed hearts and minds in this country for many years. Kate Bornstein and her lover, Barbara Carrellas, wrote the foreword to my book. And Kate's incredible philosopher and writer, but she's also quite funny. And she said, there's an old joke about Woodstock, and the same holds true for Stonewall. If all the people who said they were at Stonewall were really there that night, it would populate a not so large European country, you know. So
So you didn't have to be there to have been impacted.
You have to be there in that building, right?
Right. You're there sort of
to be effective. Yeah,
energetically or something. So maybe you could just tell the story of Stonewall too, because I don't know the demographics of my listeners, but I have to imagine some of them are like, oh, I've sort of heard that. What was it?
Sure. Stonewall Tavern was, and still is, a gay bar in the West Village in New York City that's been predominantly a gay neighborhood. It was a bar that was open and welcoming to all different kinds of people. And it was a bar that often got raided. Police would raid the bars, just like they did in other cities across the country and in other countries. And what would happen is the lights would turn on and off a couple of times. And if you were dancing with someone of your own gender, you noticed, you pulled apart, you went and found somebody of a different gender, and you started dancing with them. The cops would come in, someone behind the bar would pay off whoever was there, and the cops would leave. And this happened very often. And if there was an actual arrest, people would very dutifully walk out and find their way into the paddy wagon and get arrested, and often face tremendous odds in terms of losing their housing, their employment, familial relations. So
Yeah.
Really serious, and got beat up a lot.
Right. So a lot at stake.
A lot at stake. And
Yeah.
Stonewall is seen as the quote unquote birth of the modern gay rights movement. However, Jessa, one of the coolest things about being a sexuality educator interested in history, I'm not a historian, remember, I'm just an educator, was that as I went back, I realized there were other rebellions before Stonewall, but you didn't hear about them that often.
Okay.
Stonewall happened right at people talk about the intersection, right at the convergence of people in the anti-war movement, people in the Black liberation movement, people in the Puerto Rican liberation movement, people in the Native American movement, people in the women's movement, in the peace movement, all converging in the Village in New York City, day to day, having demonstrations in Washington Square Park. And that night, for some reason, and we still don't know really why.
Yeah, because it's not like this was premeditated, right? It just sort of spontaneously happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, later on, like the second, third, fourth, and fifth nights, we think there was a lot more organizing. But
Right.
that night, and there's a story in my book about a butch lesbian who said, I'm not going to take this anymore. We don't really know if she was the first one. There's all these stories that who threw the first beer bottle or the first brick. We don't know. But the key thing that I'm trying to explain to you and the listeners, which is so great to be able to say this, is that night, enough people at Stonewall said, it's my turn.
Yeah.
I'm not going to take it anymore. And I'm going to stand up for myself. And people stood out on the streets and they went into rebellion mode. And it's not pretty.
Yeah.
It's not fun. It wasn't peaceful. I just really want to be sure people understand. But it made the Village Voice, the New York Times, and sometimes a historical event goes on and it goes unseen. And sometimes the press will be there. And
Right.
This time the press was there. In fact, the Village Voice reporter got inside the bar at one point.
Wow.
Hi, it's Jessa here, taking just a quick break. Thanks for listening so far. I wanted to let you know about the sex quiz that I've put together called How Healthy Is Your Sex Life? I've taken a close look at the typical ways that I see couples get into trouble with sex, including avoidance, neglect, negativity, distraction, and boredom. And the free quiz will score your individual results based on these factors. And then I provide my recommendations and ideas, including my top 10 sex tips, which will help you make instant improvement. If you'd like to take the quiz and see how healthy your sex life is, you can do it right now at sexhealthquiz.com.
So how does this connect to what you're trying to do with the book, with these stories? Why is that point of rebellion and of change, shift in momentum? What is that relevant to what you're trying to do with the book?
For people in the Stonewall generation, prior to the late 60s, coming out was a terrible time. In fact, it was a turbulent time. And the Stonewall years, those late 60s, early 70s, were a time of fear. And in the book, I talk about a time of secrecy where intimate lives were hidden in the shadows. But in the midst of it all, this generation, the Stonewall generation, the people who came of age or came out in that late 60s, early 70s period of real turbulence in our society, has continued to fight for freedom, for legal rights, for love, and yes, for sex. And so that's why this is important. The Stonewall Generation has continued to be activists. There are people in my book who contributed their stories to the book. One woman is 90 this year, and she's still active to the extent that her health concerns allow her. She's still active. There are people in their 70s and 80s in the book who are still active. There are people who have not stopped since that time. And I believe that the real gift that they gave me in giving me their stories, because remember, I shepherd, it's like you're a sex therapist, you hold space for people.
Right.
I held space for people to tell me their stories. The coolest thing was to be able to go out and interview people. I crisscrossed the country. I went all over the place. I wanted people who didn't look like me. I'm a white, cisgendered, older, Jewish lesbian, middle class. I could have found a lot of those women, but I didn't want that. I wanted people who looked real different than me and who had very different experiences. And so the people that gave me their gift showed me that I could teach younger people how they can now transform their own lives using the inspiration of these older adults.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to do two things, and I don't know if I'm going to succeed. One is I'm trying to combat ageism, which I'm always trying to do. People think, oh, you're all washed up, you're over the hill, you can't get it up, you're dried up. It's horrible, horrible, horrible.
Yeah.
All of that is wrong. And the second thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to combat this idea that a gay or lesbian or bi or trans or queer identity is a young identity. I want people to see that there are older trans people. Often I hear people say, oh, there aren't that many trans people in our senior living community because it's really just kind of a new thing.
Right. It's some new phenomenon, right?
Yeah. It's not, So I think it's very important for me to try and bring together these different kinds of oppressions. And the third one that I think that I've been doing all my professional life, and now through this summer that we've had of Black Lives Matter movements all over the country, is that I really tried very hard to make sure people's racial and ethnic identities were really different so that you could get some different kinds of perspectives that way. So, as a result, if you look in the book, one of the things that I was able to do was bring a photographer with me to all of the interviews. And then the photographers did a beautiful job of creating a color portrait of each person that begins their chapter of the book. So I write a little contextual description of them. There's this photo. You get a sense, okay, this is not a young white gay man with washboard abs. This is an older Black lesbian.
Yeah.
African man who's gay. I get it. There's different pictures that you have in your head. So I wanted that as well.
Yeah. So it sounds like not only are you trying to empower and center these different voices, but also to increase this visibility or break this stereotypical picture people might have in their head, right? Like this looks like all kinds of ways, all kinds of ages, all kinds of colors, all kinds of,
Exactly. Yeah. You got it. In fact, you can help me with this.
Hopefully I am exactly with this conversation.
Thank you.
And it's interesting with only 10 stories. I mean, I find this in my own, my own business trying to promote, how do you capture the diversity of humankind and sexuality, even with 10 different people? It's like, that's a lot to kind of try to speak to all at once.
Yeah. It's hard to get your arms around it too, because there's so many people in my book from marginalized communities.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that, this is my opportunity to pass the spotlight over to them.
Right. So is there any part of this that, is there any thought or idea that you have that the younger generation has a complacency that needs to get addressed? Like, we've achieved our stuff. Like, they maybe don't understand where it started before Stonewall, or they don't understand the work that still needs to be done. Is there something like that too, in terms of like, let's put a little fire under some people?
Great question. So I've been involved in working toward building civil rights for LGBTQ people. I've been working in many ways in electoral campaigns, in legislative campaigns. And what I've come to realize is that fantastic and has given me and other people in this community a much better life to live. However, it has not changed the underlying need for liberation.
Mm.
So I call this the kind of quandary between assimilation politics and liberation politics. And if you look at pride festivals, couldn't look at them in 2020. We didn't have any. But earlier, the last couple of years, pride festivals are amazing, and they're multi-generational and multi-ethnic and every level.
Right.
We see the preschool kids and the banks and the religious organizations. Great. But it's also lacking something. And when I helped to organize the first little tiny gay pride festival, it was a march. It wasn't even a march, it was a stand, because we were too nervous to actually march. There were too many people out there who were railing against us. We had people with paper bags over their heads, literally. They were afraid to show their faces.
Wow.
And we talked about gay liberation in those days. So this was 1981. So think about the difference between liberation and assimilation. It's about thinking that we're getting enough rights that we can stand on, that we'll be okay. But when they want to go after us, think about Mike Pence or what Trump has done with, any marginalized community. As soon as they can, they just rip away those kinds of things when you're not in the fabric of society. And so my hope is that this summer has really given me great, great inspiration from young people who have been demonstrating all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
And my hope is that the politics and the excitement that has been drawn from Black Lives Matter and other associated organizations and the work that people are doing right now this fall could help us transform pride back to what it used to be in 1970, the first Pride March. Now, the first Pride March, by the way, in New York City, did not allow drag queens. And Sylvia Rivera, who has since passed, was a very active, really important person in the trans community, said that, those people in the gay pride committee didn't really want her.
Yeah.
And so what I'd like to say is I'd like to go back to the early radical politics, but be more inclusive.
Okay. Right. And so what is missing in the current pride environment, do you think?
It's missing that really exciting sort of sexual politics that I love to hear about, I love to talk about. And that's an ingredient that we could bring back.
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you see pride going? I mean, hopefully we all get to come out of quarantine and gather in places again someday, right? You said there were not typical pride, marches or anything this June.
Yeah.
What do you think that COVID, what do you think that's going to change, whether we get to march again someday or not?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. For me, what I've seen is that people are getting very antsy and they want to see change at all fundamental levels. So the fact that our nation is in a conversation about race and racial injustice means that we're also having conversations about food injustice, environmental injustice. We're talking about age injustice. One of the new courses that I want to be teaching this year is about bias in long-term care. Mm-hmm. So what that means is who's taking care of who, and what's the financing, and what's the economics behind it. I'll probably get into trouble for doing this, but I like it. I like the idea.
You wanted to get into trouble. You let off with that. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that's the future is connecting these movements, because one of the problems in the 80s and the 90s was we were very interested in identity politics, but it kind of made us a little bit too pillarized. We became a little bit too siloed. And I'm interested in sort of taking those apart. Think about what Rosemary Besson did to Masters and Johnson's idea of human sexual response. She did a circle rather than this kind of mountaintop that you go up to and come down.
Right.
Well, some people may have an orgasm that goes up and comes down. That's fine. But what I love about Besson is she said, let's bring it in a circle. And I think that's what I'm trying to do, is bring more and allow more inside the circle.
Yeah. So what do you do next? Where are you got the book out. I mean, there's a certain amount of work in promoting it and sharing that message, but what do you think's in your future?
Yes, thank you for helping me promote it. It's so much fun. Well, I just wrote a discussion guide. The book, I believe, can help people become more inclusive of LGBTQ elders in their own organizations or congregations. The publisher for my book is Skinner House. And Skinner is the nonprofit publisher for the Unitarian Universalist Association. And they've been fantastic to work with. And for a lot of their books, because they have a real social justice mission through their congregations, a lot of their books, they have an accompanying discussion guide. Can take the book and bring it into his or her or their community. So I wrote this discussion guide. I'm hoping that somebody will call me and we'll be able to have a little discussion together. You know, I can't go out anymore. So
well, that's true.
I'm available. So
okay, so you're sitting there waiting for your phone to ring, right? You want to get in these conversations.
And then I'm also I'm toying with these new courses. Another course that I'm interested in is the ethical nature and actually the legal side of older adults' cognitive decline and sexuality. Dementia and sexuality have been really a difficult nexus for people, and I think we need more work on that. And I'm working with a graduate student who's developing an assessment tool. I'm trying to do more training, and I'd like to do more policy development on that too.
Yeah.
It's not something that most people think about, but I'm really concerned about it. And I think it's taking the place of that early fear that people had that older adults were all getting sexually transmitted infections at these large senior living communities. And although that's true in some of them, that's not really the biggest issue. What I'm really concerned about is, do people have the ability and the right to have consent, to have a sex positive future? Right. A couple of years ago, Jess, I did this really fun thing. I totally recommend it to everybody. I did a TEDx talk. They're easier to do than TED Talks.
Right.
You don't have to. Anyway, so the bar was a little lower. It was still really hard for me because I had to memorize and it was really scary. But anyway, the talk I gave was, is it okay for grandma to have sex?
Yeah.
And the great thing about that was I directed my talk to administrators, clinical people who are all working with older adults and the staff to try to begin to change this idea that we can be more sex positive with older adults. Right. So that's part of the future for me as well.
Cool. I know the next podcast episode I want to do with you then, because I would love to talk about that. So, well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today.
Thank you, Jess. I really appreciate it. And I'll be happy to leave you my links as well. So you can share this.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question and answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.